Good evening. This is the BBC World Service News. I'm Ed Mitchell. The headlines tonight: there's turmoil in Yugoslavia's capital, Belgrade, as thousands of rival demonstrators take to the streets. America's Secretary of State, James Baker, arrives in Israel hours after troops shoot dead 6 Arab gunmen. OPEC oil ministers meet for the first time since the Gulf War. Production and prices are on the agenda. And the refugee children of Albania, alone in a strange new land. The Yugoslav capital, Belgrade, has been in ferment for a third successive day. After a night of violence, thousands of anti-government demonstrators kept up their pressure on the Serbian leader Slobodan Milosevic. They called for an end to political control of the media and for a full investigation into Saturday's clashes in which 2 people were killed. 2 miles away, government supporters held a rival rally. The Serbian parliament is now meeting to discuss the demonstrators' demands.
At midnight on Sunday, the streets of Belgrade once again echoed to the crack of tear gas canisters. Serbian riot police tried to stop several thousand anti-communist students from marching into the city centre. Through a curtain of acrid smoke, running battles went on for over an hour. Several of the students fell injured under the police barrage. Students managed to break through the tight police cordon and gathered around a monument in the city centre. Several hundred students kept up an all-night vigil, surrounded by menacing ranks of police armed with automatic rifles. As an icy dawn broke over the tense city, the police finally backed down and marched back to barracks, to triumphant jeers from the students. Later, the Serbian authorities appeared to concede at least one of the students' demands. An emergency session of parliament was convened to debate Saturday's violent clashes, which left 1 demonstrator and 1 policeman dead. Meanwhile, rival rallies were taking place of pro- and anti-government demonstrators. Supporters of the ruling Serbian socialists condemned the demonstrators as terrorists and traitors. But as the day wore on, the city centre resounded to the cheers of more than 30,000 anti-government demonstrators as messages of support and news of similar protests came in from other towns and cities. The pressure on the government grew visibly, and the people of Belgrade and Yugoslavia were asking the question few had dared to ask: whether their turn had come to witness the beginning of the end of one of the region's last authoritarian regimes.
Well, joining me now is Nenad Šebek of the BBC's Yugoslav section. Nenad, who is actually behind all this? Why is it happening now?
Well, the demonstrations started through the Serbian opposition parties, which is mainly the Serbian Renewal Movement and some other opposition parties. But in the meantime, yesterday, they turned into students' demonstrations. Why is it all happening right now? It's probably happening right now because economically the situation is worse than it ever was. People haven't been paid salaries for a number of months. Taxes have risen. Small business is not going as successfully as Slobodan Milosevic has promised. Economically, it's as bad as it ever was.
Now, how dangerous is this threat of the opposition parties to walk out of parliament if certain of their demands aren't met?
It's not dangerous at all. I mean, they can walk out of the parliament. The parliament will continue to work because Slobodan Milosevic's ruling socialist party still has 4/5 of the seats in the parliament.
Now, some people have said that the entire fabric of Yugoslavia is at stretching point, at breaking point. How close are we to the edge of the abyss in Yugoslavia?
We're extremely close to that edge, but we have been extremely close to that edge for the past 3 or 4 years. So nobody can tell how far the fabric can stretch. It has been stretched much further than anybody had expected that it would be possible at all.
Are events now beyond Milosevic?
It could well be, but I doubt that he will be ousted at this very minute. I also doubt that he will manage to stay in power for the full 4 years that he and his parliament have left. But I do think that he still has another year ahead.
Because he has got the military behind him, hasn't he? How key is that?
He's got a part of the military. If he had full control of the military, he would be in a much stronger position and he would be able to influence much more events in the rest of Yugoslavia as well. He doesn't have the full support of the military. He has some support there. How much at this moment, nobody can tell.
Does he want to hold Yugoslavia together? Does he want to hold Serbia together?
He certainly wants to hold Serbia together. He used to talk a lot about holding Yugoslavia together until about 3 or 4 months ago. Since then, he's been mainly talking about Serbia, whether because he realizes that he can't hold Yugoslavia together or simply because his aims have become smaller. We can't say at this moment.
Nenad, thanks very much indeed. The American Secretary of State, James Baker, has arrived in Israel on the latest leg of his Middle East tour. Heightened tension in the country has already caused him to change his plans. A visit to the old city of Jerusalem was cancelled following the killing of 4 Israeli women there yesterday. And early this morning, Israeli soldiers shot dead 6 Arab gunmen as they tried to cross the border from Jordan. We have 2 reports. The first from Cairo, where Mr. Baker began his diplomatic day meeting President Mubarak.
It turned out to be an extended meeting that covered regional security, arms control, economic cooperation, and the Arab-Israeli conflict. America's message to the Arab world is that the time is ripe for a deal with Israel, return of the occupied territories in return for Arab recognition of Israel. And the cooperation built up through the war appears to have carried through, though there clearly wasn't agreement on all matters.
Well, we're still in the early stages of addressing some of the questions that will, of necessity, have to be addressed in the aftermath of this crisis. I just didn't mean to suggest that there is absolute, total unanimity of view on everything.
Mr. Baker didn't say so, but one problem is who will represent the Palestinians when the time comes for Arabs and Israelis to sit across a table. America says the PLO is not fit to speak for Palestine. Instead, tomorrow in Israel, Mr. Baker will be meeting Palestinians he claims are free of PLO influence. Mr. Baker moves on to Israel at a time when America's relations with that country are more complex than ever. Israel's restraint during the war clearly leaves it in a strong position. And yet, if America is to remain faithful to its Arab allies, Mr. Baker will have to tell Israel there could be penalties if it doesn't deal with its neighbors. And as Mr. Baker was leaving for Israel, officials said a part of his program in Jerusalem had been cancelled for fear of contributing to the tension there. The diplomacy of the new order is still struggling against the violence of the old.
The day of Mr. Baker's visit here was also the day when the 4 Israeli women who were stabbed to death at a bus stop in Jerusalem were buried. And yet there is a faint hope today of breaking this cycle of hatred and grief.
It makes us even more determined to work just as hard as we can to see if we can arrive at peace between Arabs and Israelis.
The defeat of Iraq and the fact that Israel's other enemy, Syria, has allied itself to the Americans may just have altered everything.
We'll negotiate a peace with any Arab country. Our only precondition for negotiation is this, that the person, the leader who negotiates with us, accepts our existence.
The old city of Jerusalem, which Israel captured from the Arabs in 1967, was shuttered and silent today as Palestinians protested against Mr. Baker's visit. The Israelis decided to cancel plans to show him round here. Yet a few leading Palestinians are starting to talk a new language.
What is the alternative to the present crazy situation? Killing Palestinian children, stabbing Israeli women is not a way of life. The only way of life is to make peace. I want to have peace with our Israeli neighbors.
The militant Palestinian groups won't accept that. Along the line of Israel's border with Jordan, 6 guerrillas tried to infiltrate Israeli territory this morning, presumably to coincide with Mr. Baker's visit. All were killed, and the Israeli soldiers who caught them went off singing a song of victory. It's Mr. Baker's difficult task here to persuade Israelis and Arabs to look beyond all this. As he visited the memorial to Jewish sufferings of the past, his plan for relieving the present sufferings on both sides is simple enough: to get the Arabs to accept Israel's right to existence in exchange for a negotiated return of Arab territories conquered by Israel. Land for peace. It may just have a chance.
Iraqi opposition groups are meeting in the Lebanese capital Beirut as part of their campaign to remove President Saddam Hussein from power. They represent groups who have been actively involved in fighting against government forces inside Iraq. The 300 opposition leaders include Iranian-backed Shia Muslims who are dominant in the south of Iraq. Kurdish opposition parties from the north say they've taken control of a number of towns, including Suleymaniye, and are on the verge of taking the important oil centre of Kirkuk. But there's no independent confirmation. There's already broad agreement among opposition leaders about the formation of a coalition government, but they say their immediate aim is to get political support from the international community. A delegation from the United Nations will visit Kuwait this week to assess the number of civilians killed by the Iraqi army. In Kuwait City, more evidence is emerging of the atrocities committed during the occupation. One Kuwaiti resistance video shows a public execution being carried out.
In occupied Kuwait, executions were an almost daily routine, and on this patch of waste ground, 3 more people are about to die. One afternoon last November, their fate was secretly filmed from an upstairs window. We don't know the identity of the victims, but it seems most likely they were in fact Iraqi soldiers being punished by their own colleagues for some misdemeanor. A sizable crowd has gathered to watch the execution, but troops march past in the background almost as if nothing is going on, and a child cycles nonchalantly by. The 6-man execution squad take aim and fire, and the video goes on to show them shooting for some 30 seconds. Afterwards, onlookers drift away, and an army ambulance collects the corpses. For human rights investigators now in Kuwait, trying to catalogue all the crimes and killings here is a daunting task.
We can't do everything. I think what we're trying to do is to be as sure as we can, using our medical expertise, that some of these events have clearly happened. Some of the atrocities that are alleged, we won't really ever be in a position to say definitely happened, but we may be able to suggest that the evidence supports them and that a lot of people's statements corroborate each other.
One Kuwaiti keen to give his evidence is Mohammed Al-Rakaf, who today took us to the Naif Palace, where he says he was tortured.
One of the ways that they used to interrogate you is this bar, they have to have a chain here with a hook. And the thing that they used to do, and they handcuffs you to the back of your hand, and they just put your handcuffs on the chain and they hang you upside down from here. And this is the electric wire that they used to connect from the electricity to the bar here.
Elsewhere, Kuwaitis have shown us other equipment they claim was used for torture, but the problem for human rights investigators here is that much of the evidence was destroyed by the Iraqis before they left.
Oil ministers of the Organisation of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, are meeting in Geneva to negotiate new production levels. Reports describe the talks, the first since the Gulf War, as difficult. The world's largest producer, Saudi Arabia, is reluctant to cut its high output, while other countries want production reduced immediately to shore up prices. Out of the 13 OPEC members, only Iraq decided not to attend.
As the ministers gathered in Geneva, they faced the toughest bargaining session in the long history of tough OPEC negotiations. Oil is still in surplus and consumption is falling as the spring weather cuts demand in the northern hemisphere. Last July, on the eve of the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, the OPEC members agreed to limit output to 22.5 million barrels a day. Iraq's assault on Kuwait and the subsequent economic sanctions against Baghdad removed 20% of the total overnight. But others moved quickly to make up the difference. Saudi Arabia raised output to more than 8 million barrels a day. Venezuela also used spare capacity, so that as an organization, OPEC more than made up for the shortfall. So the surge in prices was short-lived. After moving up from below $20 to about $40 a barrel in October, crude prices fell back steadily, and when war broke out, they fell back below $20. For the moment, the destruction of Kuwait's production capacity and the continuing embargo against Iraq mean that OPEC members can enjoy a breathing space, but commentators say things will change.
In the longer term, when Iraq and Kuwait come back into the market, if you've divided up the quota cake amongst 11 of OPEC's 13 members, and then 2 more start producing, then it raises question marks about the stability of the market later on, because it means that somebody's going to have to take a cut somewhere.
So OPEC ministers face the dilemma of supporting an agreed oil price just as 3 of the biggest producers, Saudi Arabia, Iraq and Kuwait, will all be aiming for the highest possible output to pay for the ravages of war. In the oil world, the more you produce, the lower the price.
Well, a couple of minutes ago in London, the price of April Brent crude was at $18.40 a barrel. That's down 40 cents on Friday's level. That's for April. The dispute between Britain and the United States over landing rights at London's main airport, Heathrow, has been settled. The disagreement arose because the American airline Pan Am wanted to sell its transatlantic routes and with them landing rights at Heathrow. The British Transport Secretary, Malcolm Rifkind, says that the agreement will offer British Airlines major new opportunities on transatlantic routes. Later in this World Service news, Bulgaria's former communist leader on trial. We've a special report on the violent events that led to his downfall. And the headlines again, massive demonstrations in Belgrade for and against the government after last night's violence. Israeli troops kill 6 Arab gunmen hours before America's Secretary of State arrives for talks. And OPEC oil ministers meet to discuss cutting production and raising prices. The Italian authorities have started relocating the thousands of Albanian refugees who have arrived by boat in the last few days. The Deputy Prime Minister, Claudio Martelli, has gone to Albania to discuss the crisis. Thousands of people have sailed into the Italian port of Brindisi, more than 70 of them children who arrived without their parents. Temporary camps have been set up to provide food and shelter.
Order has returned to the waters off Brindisi, and the Italians have stemmed the flow of refugees. The only Albanian boat that came in today carried officials who've come to negotiate the return of the fishing boats commandeered by the fleeing refugees. The Italians have declared them unseaworthy. 10,000 refugees are still in Brindisi, among them 75 children without parents. Some of them had braved the ocean crossing alone, leaving their parents behind. Others got separated in the 4 days of confusion. Italy had been totally unprepared for the sudden arrival of the Albanians. Each day saw thousands scrambling up and down the gangplanks of their ships. Fear and indecision still haunted them as the West decided whether it wanted them or not. The first and most urgent need was for food. Was this the promised land the Albanians had dreamed of? Shelter was a problem and the rain persistent. The docks at Brindisi became Plastic City. Trains had been promised, but these weren't going anywhere. The people of Brindisi filled the gap. They organized themselves quickly. Second-hand clothes were better than anything these people could get at home. Food distribution became more humane. But as many of the refugees reboarded their boats with their handouts, it became clear that not all had come to seek a new life. The agony of the ship Tirana was the struggle between those wanting to go home again, those wanting to stay, and those who didn't know. Albania is by far the poorest country in Europe. Its population has increased by 1/3 in 10 years, the fastest in Europe. It's the last bastion of Eastern hardline communism.
All the Albanians, especially the young people that fled, think that Albania is the bottom of the world, and they are quite sure that anywhere they go, they will be only better and not worse.
As the trains pull out of Brindisi, taking the refugees to Army and Red Cross camps around Italy, the government is faced with what to do with 12,000 new immigrants. The scramble to the west was so risky, so desperate, that the Italian authorities know they'd have a heartbreaking task forcing Albanians to get back on these boats and go back home. Even before the trains left, some refugees had decided to brave the highways. Most of them are penniless and have no idea where to go.
It's well over a year since the Bulgarian leader Todor Zhivkov was ousted, heralding the end of 4 decades of communist rule. His trial on charges of fraud and embezzlement is now entering its 3rd week. But as Bulgaria's new leaders come to terms with his legacy of economic woe and ethnic tension, they've revealed that they intend to make him face a 2nd trial.
The transition from communism to democracy in Bulgaria was never as violent as in neighbouring Romania. In fact, it started out as a very non-violent revolution. But on the night of the 27th of August last year, after elections, which to the surprise of outsiders at least kept the communists in power, the people of Sofia finally vented their anger on their old rulers, now calling themselves socialists. Setting fire to the huge party headquarters in central Sofia, they ransacked its offices, even finding ham, sausages and toilet paper inside, goods that had all but disappeared from the shops. Books, documents, the whole paraphernalia of communist propaganda went up in flames. But the people's hatred was really focused on one man, Bulgaria's dictator for more than 3 decades, Todor Zhivkov, who'd already been edged out of office the year before by rivals who said they wanted to reform the party. Now Zhivkov's on trial for fraud, bribery, embezzlement, and the illegal procurement of houses, flats and cars for his entourage. Bulgaria's current president, Zhelev of the non-socialist Union of Democratic Forces, admits it is in effect a political trial. But he says this won't be enough.
There must be a political trial in which we shall bring charges against Zhivkov of forcing the Turkish population to change their names, driving them out of the country, and of sending dissidents to work in concentration camps in the 60s. He was also involved in the forced collectivization of agriculture. He should answer all these charges.
Todor Zhivkov says the trial is a farce. The charges are petty. Put the whole party in the dock, he says. I want a political trial. The party's answer to that is there can be no collective guilt, only the personal guilt for specific individual crimes. As he listens to the witnesses, Todor Zhivkov may or may not be contemplating the Latin motto on the wall above the figure of justice behind the judge's chair. It says, "The laws administered in this court are intended to preserve our freedoms."
The British Prime Minister John Major and Chancellor Kohl of Germany have spoken of a new warmth between their two countries. After a day of talks in Bonn, the two leaders said they had agreed on a wide range of issues, including encouragement for reform in the Soviet Union and the need for a peaceful resolution of the Arab-Israeli conflict.
It was all smiles as this first full-scale Anglo-German summit since German unification got underway in Bonn, with none of the obvious tensions of the Thatcher years. Chancellor Kohl and Prime Minister Major have met twice before, briefly. From the very beginning, they've been on first-name terms. The message Mr. Major and his ministers brought was a simple one. Whether on political or on monetary integration, there'll be no more governmental sniping from the sidelines from London, even though the two sides still differ, although less than they did, on precisely where they want Europe to go. On the eve of Mr. Major's departure for his talks in Bonn, there came a reminder of past tensions from the previous tenant of number 10 Downing Street, interviewed on American television. Germany, said Mrs. Thatcher, recalling the warnings of her last months in office, would dominate Europe, and many of us wouldn't necessarily like that. Mr. Major is plainly not among those who were worried about Germany, and this new warmth is being reciprocated with interest in Bonn. The Germans are moving closer towards Britain's caution on a single European currency, and British officials say the differences on political union will almost certainly be bridged as well. Mr. Major's un-Thatcherite enthusiasm for Germany extends to Europe itself. In a keynote speech in Bonn later in the day, he was to pledge Britain's determination to be, as he put it, where it belonged, at the very heart of Europe, working with its partners in building the future.
The former Prime Minister of Greece, Andreas Papandreou, has gone on trial in Athens accused of involvement in a big banking scandal. Millions of dollars of public money are alleged to have been embezzled. Mr. Papandreou is accused of taking bribes in connection with the scandal. He's denied the charges and did not appear in court today. The Secretary-General of the Commonwealth has said the near 50-nation organisation has an important role to play in a rapidly changing world. In an interview earlier today, Commonwealth Day, I asked Chief Emeka Anyoku about the prospects for South Africa's readmission to the Commonwealth after a 30-year absence.
Indeed, I envisage that South Africa will be coming back to the Commonwealth. I hope that they will be coming back. They left the Commonwealth because of the unacceptable apartheid system. Now we have the beginnings of the end of apartheid. It's very difficult to put a time to it, but I would imagine that before my term of office is up, which is within the next 5 years, that South Africa will return to the Commonwealth.
But they have more to do.
They have a lot more to do, because at the moment they have made very promising beginnings, but the essential structures of apartheid are still in place. Some of the direct consequences of those structures are still very much there to see. They would need to remove these structures. They would need to improve the atmosphere. But as soon as that is done, I expect that they would be warmly welcomed back to the Commonwealth.
Where does the Commonwealth as an organisation stand in this rapidly changing world, and what is its future?
The rapidly changing world is throwing up challenges, the sort of challenges the Commonwealth is specially equipped to deal with. And the Commonwealth, therefore, is going to remain even more relevant and even more important to its member countries. If you look at one of the new challenges, the challenge of how to cope with pluralistic societies. Wherever you look, you have these problems of the latent divisive tendencies in pluralistic countries reasserting themselves. And the Commonwealth has made a virtue of unity in diversity. And I think that that's a lesson that will be of use to the rest of the world.
In Johannesburg, the lawyer defending Winnie Mandela on kidnap and assault charges has accused a key prosecution witness of living in a dream world and lying in court. The witness, Kenneth Gassi, admitted that he'd misled the court with some of his testimony, but stood by details of his alleged kidnap and assault by Mrs. Mandela. El Salvador's ruling right-wing party, Arena, says it has a clear majority after yesterday's elections, but left-wing parties say they increased their share of the vote. An international meeting to discuss Southeast Asia's boat people has been called for the end of this month. It follows the failure, so far, of attempts by the authorities in Hong Kong to persuade Vietnamese refugees to go home. The British Foreign Office says that this month's informal meeting in Geneva will prepare the ground for a full-scale international conference on the matter later in the year.
At this old British Army camp near the Chinese border, Asia's Cold War refuses to go away. The Lo Wu detention centre was set up to process Vietnamese boat people, disillusioned with Hong Kong's camps and wanting to go home. For the past year, Britain has been saying that it wants at least 1,000 Vietnamese to be repatriated every month, but that's proved to be just a pipe dream. At this special camp for volunteers, there are only 23 boat people waiting to go back. Lo Wu is designed to take 1,200 people, but most of its huts are locked up. There are more police than Vietnamese.
There's also, I think, a lot of disinformation going around the other detention centres in Hong Kong at the moment.
What sort of disinformation is
Well, I believe there's a lot of information going around to the boat people saying that, you know, whilst conditions in Hong Kong are not very, very good, that they're still better off than they are in Vietnam.
2 repatriation flights this month have been cancelled because there's only a trickle of applicants. It's estimated that 40,000 Vietnamese should go back, but they clearly prefer camp life in Hong Kong. Even those handful of volunteers paint a grim picture of their future.
If we look at it this way, Vietnam is a very, very poor country, one of the poorest ones and uncivilized.
Vietnam blames much of its poverty on America's aid and trade embargo, a policy left over from its defeat 16 years ago.
We have, as an international community, to begin to tackle much more actively the economic origins of the present outflow from Vietnam, and to begin to recognize that unless we do that, unless we actually create a future in Vietnam for those that we keep telling have to go back, the problem is going to be much, much harder to solve.
The hope now in Hong Kong and Vietnam is that with victory in the Gulf, America can come to terms with its defeat in Asia and help end this tragic exodus from Vietnam.
And another look at tonight's headlines. In Yugoslavia, thousands of pro- and anti-government demonstrators have filled the streets of Belgrade. The American Secretary of State, James Baker, is seeing Israeli leaders on the latest leg of his Middle East tour. And OPEC oil ministers are meeting for the first time since the Gulf War to discuss cutting production. That's the BBC World Service News on Monday, the 11th of March. From me, Ed Mitchell, good night.